Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And I am joined today by Lisa Fazio, who's written a beautiful book called Della Medicina. And here it is. And you will, of course, have noticed immediately that it is an Italian title. So, Lisa, why is it an Italian title?
Well, I'm of Italian descent. I'm American, second generation Italian American, and I speak some Italian and just came up with the name Della Medicina to describe my work. And Della Medicina, for those who don't know, means of medicine. And so my work is primarily as an herbalist and a folk medicine practitioner. So the name kind of came out of that as the work of medicine.
Why your book, for me has so much that I love. Firstly, it's about folklore and herbal medicine, folk medicine, specific to your ancestry, which is another element that is very attractive. But I think what I also really love about it is that you're writing in the spirit of rediscovery of your roots and being having been uprooted at the age of 8 myself
Mm,
is now the third country in which I'm living.
hmm.
um I really, it calls to my heart hearing or reading your the way you're piecing everything together. So I guess my question is, what is it that led you in this direction?
Yeah, so I'm, as I said, second generation Italian American. I'm also Irish American. My mother's line is from Ireland, but I grew up in an Italian American community. And so my cultural conditioning is as Italian American. So some of it is just how I was shaped as I grew. Um, and then I became an herbalist and working a lot with the bioregional local plants where I live, which is in the Adirondacks of New York State. So I spent a lot of time working with the plants that are here, including species that were brought from other places, whether Europe or Asia, and doing native plant restoration as well, native plant conservation restoration, and working in different groups, organizing in my community with Native American peoples and the Black community and other places. And as I was doing that, it became important in that work that I understood my own ancestry. So here in the United States, a lot of times we assimilate, right? And the immigrants come and we try, and that definitely was the case for my Italian grandparents who were immigrants, is that everybody wanted to fit in as best as they could because that's how you get access to jobs and resources. So we lose that connection. And not knowing who we are makes it hard for us to really truly know where we are now and how we got here and how we are in relationship to other groups of people as well as other immigrant groups and the indigenous people and so on. And so it's kind of a process of evolution for me.
The issue of assimilation, we do need to assimilate because we need to have common ground on which we communicate with each other and understand each other. So
Right.
assimilation is absolutely essential. But within that assimilation, the roots are also very important. And it's also important for the host culture to have their roots too. And it's about creating that ability to be distinct and also appreciate the differences, that it's so crucial. And
Yeah.
that's why it really is so important that we understand where we came from. And just in my mind, there is a song, as we were speaking, by a fabulous folk group called Show of Hands, and they have a song called Roots. And it's very clear in one of the lines in the song: without our stories, without our songs, how will we know where we come from? And there they're talking about the loss of the sense of being English, for assimilating into something that's like a melding London everything and nothing. That loss of the regional accents, even, just to everybody sounding the same. And I think that that's such an important thing that we forget.
Yeah, and I think in the United States, Canada, probably both North and South America, I'm assuming all of us, but my experience in the United States is that the United States doesn't have any roots. So it makes it even trickier, right? Because it's a very new country, it's a very new culture. The the indigenous people have their own roots that are separate from ours. So it's not like, for instance, and I don't, only speaking from the outside, obviously, but like I go to Italy and like the idea of an Italian culture is different than the idea of like an American culture because it's been Italy. Well, Italy's a new country, but the people have been there. So it's like it's a little bit different here, I feel like. There's like that level um of this country was specifically founded by like, well, English, Dutch, Spanish. In the United States, Anglo culture is the dominant culture. So what we think of as the United States was really formulated as that as a base. And so that adds a little bit of yes, we absolutely have to assimilate in order to survive. It's part of survival. And yeah, we have to be able to relate to each other. And then, yeah, how do we keep a sense of pluralism, I guess is really like the word I like to use to describe it. And where are we going from here? So, that's like the next question. So, like, I'm second generation and I had a certain experience, but third, fourth, fifth generation people are going to have a completely different experience.
And in order to know where we're going from here, we have to also understand who we are. And so that's the where your book comes in, because it is about this beautiful exploration of the root side of things. Yet you are exploring this out of context, because you are not living in the Italy of old, let alone modern Italy. You're not living in Italy at all. So yet again, that's an interesting twist, and the evolution in a sense. So tell us about that.
Well, so Italian American culture is distinct, right? It's not Italian culture, not the Italy of today, right? So the a culture that so the immigrants, largely the biggest mass of immigrants from Italy came around the turn of the century, around the 1900s. So like 1880 to like 1920, 25. There's been other immigrations from Italy, but that was the major one. And so what my grandparents, and that was my grandparents. My grandfather actually came in 1928, but what they brought was the culture they came over with was the culture of Italy at that time. That took root here. And the interesting thing is, so in Italy, which is, you're probably familiar, it's similar in other European countries, is each region is almost like its own little country. They had their own language, their own, they call it a dialect. They had their own, now there's a lot of similarities, but they had their own customs. They all came from mostly southern Italy and Sicily, but Sicily is it's a completely different country pretty much. And we all lived in the same neighborhoods together. And so you've got multiple different cultures actually combining. So when we talk about Italian American, it's definitely different. And then this also was just after the unification of Italy. So before that, the people who immigrated here were part of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. So it wasn't even Italy. And so, yeah, we're knowing about ourselves, knowing those changes, and then knowing how those changes evolved once people got here. And then they're dealing with different conditions here than they were dealing with there, which, again, one of the main conditions was having to assimilate.
So as you've been, I was going to say rooting around, and I've just been thinking about roots. The word's obviously on my mind. So as you've been exploring the folk traditions related to herbs and medicine um, of Italy, and I think specifically you're working with Southern Italian traditions.
Right.
What, how, what do you feel that's bringing to you?
So it brings a more stable sense of being. Not just, getting to know the plants. Many of the plants that I worked with, I did grow up with, so I had a relationship with, but I've definitely learned about, for instance, olive doesn't grow where I live. It's too cold here, So there's plants that I have made relationships with through this process. But also the folk medicine and the understanding of our folk practices creates this coherence in me of something that I feel like I'm carrying within, like I don't know what you want to call it, if it's like, the ancestral threads or epigenetic memories from my ancestors, but also an understanding of myself in place. So in where I live in the United States, in what that means, which I'm still learning, as well as what a few things about the folk medicine. One is seeing the similarities in different types of folk medicines, because there's a lot of similarities, different styles, um, different variations. We're all dealing with different things, but also seeing how important that is to being in community today. Because at some point we lost our ability to take care of ourselves and each other.
So let's go back in time a little bit and imagine ourselves in somewhere in southern Italy. Um, what does medicine look like? Are people going to doctors? Are they largely treating themselves? Is, is there a shift towards, at what point are we shifting towards allopathic medicine? And is there a blend, or are people really sticking to folk medicine?
Yeah. So in terms of when allopathic medicine came in, I'm not sure exactly, but definitely at at the after unification, and then even more so with the rise of Mussolini, where you know he enacted a lot of laws that provided public education and healthcare and things in the South. Um, People were definitely resistant to it. And a lot of, if you read like the ethnographic information, as well as talking to elders and such, they will say, that the modern medicine doesn't work as well, kind of like people go to the hospital to die, not to get better. It was, it's, now in Italy, yes, everybody's got the same better healthcare than we have here in the United States. It's very accessible and there are still people doing folk medicine, but a lot of it is disappearing in the South.
I guess really what we're talking about is the loss of a culture, because the minute we start so unifying, what we begin to do is go for a common denominator, and we are in fact eradicating a culture. And folk means people, and it's often used in a very derogatory way,
Yeah,
as in this is the peasant way and they know nothing because they have no they don't have education, they're
right.
not going to university, etc. So it's an incredibly pejorative and damning way of looking at things, and it's as old as the hills, because not long ago I discovered that the word pagan as a derogatory term was used pre-Christian times by those who lived in the cities to describe those who lived in the country and were closer to nature.
Right.
So this is a very old thing, um, and it is what you're describing there. I had no idea that Mussolini had done this, but it sounds good, doesn't it? It's modernization and progress.
It's modernization progress, and that was also the rise of Italian nationalism, and then the attempts to homogenize, um, which is, the South is still, so, you may be aware about, or I don't know about your listeners, but Southern Italy is one of the poorest regions in Europe, and Sicily. Calabria, in fact, where my grandfather's from, I think is like the poorest region. Um, so it wasn't, it's interesting because it was kind of like when the unification, the Risorgimento was, the idea was they were liberating the South from the monarchs because the monarchs weren't good either, right? Like the monarchy, but it actually just ended up making things a lot worse. And um so they've lost, yes, they've lost like their dialects, like the language that my grandparents, their native language was not Italian. It was their dialect from their my grandfather's Calabrian dialect and the Beneventano dialect of my where my grandmother was from. So they are, and some of it goes back to kind of what you were talking about assimilating. So even though, maybe you don't think about it like within a country, but like in Italy and maybe other places as well, like they economically need to to assimilate to Western European standards, economic standards, educational standards. And so a lot of people they're like, this is not going to get us forward in terms of the global complex that we're in right now. So, but like to your question, before modern times, healing, healthcare healing would look like there being a village healer, perhaps, or healers or people that could administer at least cures for minor ailments, including things like bone setting. I mean, some of them were things, you know, wound healing, uh, different types of illnesses, viruses, bacteria, stuff like that. They could manage. Uh, and then you might go to somebody who's more of a quote unquote physician. And even then, that physician is going to be using herbal medicines and probably using spiritual types of medicines. Like in Italy, for at least the last 2,000 years, it was Catholicism. And so, the roots go back into the pagan and pre-pagan practices of the Mediterranean. But within the Catholicism, there was a lot of what we might call magic, or what some people have called witchcraft, but it was practiced as a form of Catholicism and spiritual healing. And it was combined.
We see that actually happening in South America also, where there is a blending of the Catholicism
Yes.
with
Yes.
the indigenous
Yes,
traditions.
absolutely.
And it's funny that you were talking about, the assimilation process happening within Italy. And I was thinking exactly the same thing as you were saying it, that we're talking about this, what is lost when we need to assimilate, when we come in as immigrants. But actually, the same thing happens within our own countries. And it's exactly why the song Roots that I quoted earlier exists, because it's the feeling of the loss of place, tradition, and history within the wider culture that usually comes out from the capital city and
Right.
gobbles everything up in its place.
Exactly.
And if you go to Cornwall, you're going to hear the Cornish talk about themselves as a completely separate country,
Exactly.
and mourning the loss of a language. And you have in Wales, the resurgence of Welsh, etc.
Yes.
Because in some ways, we sell our souls when we are trading in for so-called modernity, or even better, progress.
Right.
And there's something that's lost. And I think that that's obviously why I'm so attracted to your book and what you're doing, because it is, I feel like it's a rebalancing. It's of saying, okay, you know what? Yes, this is fine, but there's a huge, huge thing that's sitting in the garage that's been forgotten. And we need to start unpacking that, and seeing how we can integrate it back into our lives. And perhaps minimalism isn't the thing that we need at this moment. It is enrichment.
Yeah, and so like what you're touching on there is I think another big reason why I've been compelled to do this work, um, is that there has been a loss, and for many of us, that loss, we there was no time or space or infrastructure to grieve. I was listening to, it was actually a Scottish teacher whose name I can't remember, but she was talking about Scottish keening, which is is a traditional grief practice, and how it was banned at some point in time, I think the 1600s, by the British, and how that grief, unexpressed grief, just starts to back up and build through the generations. And it occurred to me, oh, one way to conquer a people is to forbid their grief rituals, because they'll never be able to, if they can't express that, they're never going to be able to really fully know and understand themselves. And if they don't fully know and understand themselves, well, then they're never going to be, they won't rebel, right? Or want to reclaim themselves or their culture. And I feel like that's one of the things, you know, both my lineages, is that because, we were on the run for survival, you know? especially, that my Irish side came during the famine. There was no, it was just like just survive, and you got here and it wasn't like there was a warm welcome or anything, right? It's like you were like conscripted and like put in a factory and then you're so that's one of the things. So, when I teach students and see clients and stuff, almost always, everybody loves the idea of ancestral reclamation. It sounds wonderful, and it is, and it sounds healing, and it is, but almost everybody, if not everybody, once they really dive into it, gets to a place when we really realize everything that we've lost, and the grief is tremendous.
It is. And I think that that is, what you're doing there is ancestral healing too, because the grief that's experienced by immigrants when they are uprooted from their country, I think is huge because yes, they adapt, yes, they adjust, but there's a part of them that never leaves the homeland. And I'm thinking, my own mother has never been more has never clung to her roots more than she has done as she has got older.
Mm.
And before it was there, but it wasn't there because she was working, she was busy.
Right.
But now it's clearly the pain of nostalgia has finally set in, and I can feel it, I can see it.
Mm.
And I think that it's very tangible. And I have seen this being expressed by others, particularly later in life, because later in life is when people begin to reminisce and collect their memories and and be more in the past. So I think that there is that. So I think that what you're doing there is also ancestral healing of ancestral trauma, because as any gardener knows, not all plants that are uprooted and transplanted survive.
Right.
It's,
True.
yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't think we can really show up. So some of this is we can't really show up in the present. So it's not for me about going back to some ideal place and time when everything was perfect, right? And we're not even, it's impossible, for those of us living in diaspora to go back. We're not going to go back to an Italian village and have a nonna healer, right? Like that's, but we have to be fully here. The other part of it is that our folk medicine is full of wisdom, and that wisdom is very generative. So, for instance, the the different techniques can be translated, and they're inherently adaptive. Not to mention they're carrying the imprint of very, very ancient instructions, right? And so when and we don't know, we don't know everything that our ancestors did. It's impossible, right? Archaeologists argue about this all the time about what this meant or what that meant. But there's enough in there when we actually engage with the practices. So, in other words, you can read this or that or the other thing. You're really reading somebody else's compilation, and even in my own book, you're getting my compilation. It's when you engage with that and try that on that that carrying of tradition and that carrying of medicine will start to speak to you, right? And then when we start talking about it with each other, is when it starts to become even more generative.
It
So
comes alive, doesn't it?
it comes alive.
Mm.
So, one of the best examples is the Orphic hymns, which is, a major part of the foundation of Mediterranean culture. We know that written in ancient Greek, that those hymns have layers and layers of meaning. And people spend their whole lives talking about it. And when you get a bunch of people together talking about it, there is the imprints, it's like the codes in it start to unlock themselves. And then you get all of this stuff that comes out and it merges with us here and now.
One of the beautiful things about folk medicine is the interaction with nature. So tell us what that looks like when you're dealing with this. Were they preparing things according to the phases of the moon? How were they relating to, obviously the seasons is important, but you know, how were they relating to nature?
So a lot of when we're talking about Italian folk medicine, not like pre-Christian, we're talking about Christian folk medicine. I mean, it's hard to pick a time out, but they're they're certainly following the seasons, and usually a lot of this is going to be working with like the personification of natural energies. In folk Catholicism, it's going to look like saints and the different versions of La Madonna. So you've got like they're working with the seasonal cycles, the monthly cycles, and then you've got the liturgical calendar, which actually aligns with all of the seasonal cycles, as we know, right? Easter is spring. We've got the All Souls Day, which happens in the fall, and um, Christmas obviously is the solstice. So but you're working with the liturgical calendar, and then the interaction with nature is along the seasonal calendar and the feste or the festivals that celebrate usually a saint or some type of deity, could often La Madonna, but it's going to also coincide with like the grain harvest or the harvest of the olives or the harvest of the grapes. The other way that this can look is um, in terms of like sanctuaries, so sacred wells, sacred mountains, sacred places that became where they put like a cathedral or a chiesa or something like a church. So of course, there's going to be direct interaction with nature for people who are contadini or farming people. That's going to be personal to the individual or to the family.
So it's that being embedded in the natural world and being aware of the seasons and being uh, how where does the moon come in? Did they follow the phases of the moon?
I'm sure they did. I don't know of any. The only moon practices that I'm personally aware of that's coming to my mind at the moment is in terms of, well, this is kind of pre-Christian, the goddess Diana, who is Artemis. Um, she did take on different shapes of the Madonna. So I would say it would probably be in that type of.
So it's that link with the divine feminine as,
Mm.
Mother Mary, who takes on that role. Okay, and so that's the lunar deity. That's very interesting. I just wondered whether, people were, sowing seeds by, according to the phases of the moon, whether they were doing that as well.
They were, but I think a lot of that was probably going to be like pre-Christian, like um more Greek Magna Graecia, where there was Hellenic astrology. So I think that's going to be pre, I'm sure it came through there somehow, but I don't know where.
Oh, that's very interesting because in in England, almanacs were being printed for a very long time into the early 20th century, so that people could plant
Right.
according to the phases of the moon. So that's where my question came from.
Yeah, I mean, we still have them here in the US. We have the Farmer's Almanac, and and we still use it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's brilliant. Now, is there a because you're a herbalist as well, and you could see the blending here of the traditions. Um, I guess I'm wondering, is there a particular custom or way of dealing with herbs that is a favorite of yours?
Yeah, so there's a couple. So on a very practical sense, I would say that the making of unguenti or salves is one of my favorites. And it's not just Italian. It's um, a, mostly European, Western, and maybe other places as well. That salves were used much more widely than we use them today. So salves were a great way to imbibe or to extract and also preserve the medicinal components of plants. And it, it can last a long time. It's easy to preserve, and we can absorb a lot of the medicine through our skin. So they weren't just used for like, wounds like we think of today or skin conditions. You can really absorb, like you can put a lung salve with poplar buds on your chest, and that'll help relieve a cough. Um, and they were often known as witches' salves, right? And that's where from there we got flying ointments, which were the combination of specific herbs used in different types of trance and ecstatic rituals by the indigenous people. So, which we call the Sabbath. And so, like, but it started with just like, oh, here's a good way. And usually it was with lard. Nowadays we usually use beeswax, but it was usually with some type of animal fat. And the herbs were infused into that, and then that was made into an ungüento or a salve.
Mm.
Um, the other of my favorite remedies, if you want to call it that, is l'acqua di San Giovanni, which is the water of Saint John. And this is it's kind of like a flower essence and a holy water combined. It has very ancient roots. It actually goes back to the water rites festivals in ancient Rome that happened around the summer solstice. Um, and this is when you take a bowl of water and place herbs picked on St. John's Eve. So that's St. John's Day is June 24th. So June 23rd. Some people do it on the 24th, some people do it on the 23rd. You can do it either way. And then you leave it out. And the most common herb, there's many herbs that can be put into it, but St. John's wort is in bloom at that time of year. And then that water is left out overnight, and then you remove the herbs, and the water is used for blessing, um, and sacred bathing, protection.
And of course, that's the time of the summer solstice as well.
Right.
Perfect. And you know how it all kind of ties in together. And St. John's wort being a herb that we also associate with helping with depression, so the lifting of spirits,
Right.
etc. And beautiful. Well, thank you so much for for your time today. It's been
Oh,
what
thank you for having me. And I really appreciated all your questions. And yeah.
thank you. Now the book, in case you have forgotten, is called Della Medicina, and here it is. I'll be putting a link to it in the description box. And Lisa, if people wanted to find you, how do they do that?
TheRootCircle.com is the best place.
I'll be putting a link to that in the description box as well. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. And thank you all for watching. Until next time, goodbye.